Littleton 91.9.
And online at NHPR.org.
From New Hampshire Public Radio, I'm Laura Knoy, and this is The Exchange. It's the number one concern of many New Hampshire employers these days. They can't find enough workers. And it's a refrain echoed across occupations: healthcare, hospitality, construction, manufacturing, government, social services. This week, The Exchange goes in-depth with 4 shows focusing on our workforce shortage. We find out which industries are struggling the most with this. We explore efforts to attract new employees to New Hampshire, as well as develop the state's existing untapped workforce. And we look to the future at emerging ideas around these labor issues and the nature of work itself. Today, we kick off our workforce shortage series with the economic, demographic, and cultural factors behind it. Also, we'll scrutinize the numbers that define it, and let's hear from you too. Today and all week, our email is exchange@nhpr.org. Once again, exchange@nhpr.org. Use Facebook or Twitter, it's NHPR Exchange, or give us a call, 1-800-892-6477. And in addition to listening today, you can also watch our show on Facebook Live. Our guests are Brian Gottlob, principal at PolEcon Economic Research, a consulting firm based in Dover. Brian, always nice to see you. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here, Laura.
Also with us, Jeff Feingold, editor at New Hampshire Business Review. And Jeff, thank you for helping us out. We really appreciate it.
Great to be here.
And joining us by phone is Lydia DePillis, senior economics writer for CNN Business. And Lydia, really nice to have you. Thank you for your time.
No problem.
Well, Brian, I want to start with you. New Hampshire is at 2.4% unemployment. Wow, among the lowest in the nation. The head of New Hampshire Employment Security told us last week that at some job fairs, they've seen one job seeker for every 5 to 6 jobs. It just seems incredible, Brian. How did we get here?
Well, it's been a long recovery from a very deep recession. It's soon in July actually going to be the longest period of uninterrupted economic growth in our nation's history. So we've had a long period where we've been adding a good number of jobs. I think what characterizes this situation that's a little bit different than in the past is that we're in a situation where we've got a lot of issues that are confronting businesses in New Hampshire. We hear it all the time. Energy prices are a problem. Regulations are a problem. But there is nothing more important to the long-term prosperity of individual businesses or the New Hampshire economy as this particular issue, the availability and the quality of labor. Now, the other thing that's different about this situation is it's not going to be resolved when the economy weakens a bit. It'll get a little bit better. This long recovery has heightened the problem of a very low unemployment rate. But fundamentally, we're at this situation because of long-term demographic and population issues. We've had slower population growth, we've had slower labor force growth, and we haven't been able to increase our labor force participation the way we have in the past. So people think it's going to get better as the economy weakens. It will get a little bit better, but it's not going to be an issue that will be resolved unless we do something about it from a policy perspective.
Well, and a little bit later in this show, we'll play an interview that I did last week with UNH senior demographer Ken Johnson. He's got a lot to say about those migration patterns that you touched on, Brian, and also the aging of the state. Jeff, what stories do you hear from the employers who you talk to every day about this workforce shortage and what it means for them?
It's really interesting. Last week we had a roundtable with a bunch of employers from the Upper Valley, where the unemployment rate's even lower than the statewide. Yeah. I think it's probably around 2% or even lower. Who knows? But it's a free for all. So what's the big issue? And every single one was talking about workforce, because it's really it's exacerbated there because they listed a number of their concerns, and the top concern was that they said is causing the workforce shortage in their area is housing, affordable housing, which is almost impossible to find in Lebanon and in Hanover, because they have these major employers, Dartmouth-Hitchcock, Dartmouth College, Hypertherm, other very successful businesses that they need people constantly. Dartmouth-Hitchcock is the largest employer in the state, and they're constantly needing trained healthcare workers. And they're having such a hard time finding them. They have programs in place to just try to get people, attract people. I believe it was a woman from Dartmouth-Hitchcock said she has some employees who travel 2 hours to get to work because
that's
you
a
can't
long
find
commute.
affordable housing. And it raises all kinds of issues about transportation, daycare availability, which is what they're seeing as causing these other issues. That it just comes up boiling over in terms of all these problems that are happening, and you see it in places like the Upper Valley. Other places have workforce shortages, but that for other reasons entirely. Most likely, actually, the North Country is another example where there's people who just, as Brian was saying, that demographically it's becoming just older and older, and a lot of young people are just leaving. So it's an issue that's has different. There's different ramifications around the state in different areas, but the result is the same. There's still a very difficult problem for employers right now.
And Lydia, to you, give us the national perspective, please. How much is this story being repeated around the country?
Sure. And Jeff and Brian made really good points about the multifaceted nature of this problem. It is a national problem. So the number of unemployed workers per job is down to 0.8. So that means there are more job openings than there are workers who are wanting to take one. And that is as low as it's been on record. We don't have data going back to the 90s. So it's real. It is certainly worse in New Hampshire and some of these states that do have that aging demographics problem, that out-migration problem. The Midwest is another place, Iowa, Minnesota, employers desperately looking for workers. Now, it's less acute in some of these younger places that have had a lot more immigration historically. The South, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico don't have as big of an issue. Now their wages are lower, and so they have larger, younger populations that never got a chance to get into the workforce. But it's something that, it's very common to employers at this late stage in the economic cycle where we've been adding, 200,000 plus jobs a month for nearly 10 years now.
Well, what sorts of stories are you hearing, Lydia, from businesses on the ground? This is affecting my ability to open a new restaurant, or this is affecting my ability to, turn out more widgets every day. What sort of on-the-ground stories are you hearing?
Sure. I mean, one way of looking at this, besides just day-to-day conversations, is something called the Beige Book out from the Federal Reserve. Every couple months, they publish an anecdotal survey of, they literally call up businesses all across the country. And so you see where it pops up. It is those high-skilled industries like technology, but it's also, in manufacturing, right? Because we saw this resurgence in manufacturing in the last several years just because of several factors, including energy prices and currency fluctuations and desire to rebuild supply chains for the United States. And their shortages arose in part because people had been taught for a long time to point themselves towards a 4-year college degree. And so some of those professions were oversupplied, whereas people who had machining skills and welding skills and some of those types of more blue-collar professions had been undersupplied because for so long, that was not the way you were supposed to advance in the world. People didn't take out student loans to go and get that kind of degree. So in some ways, there has been sort of an imbalance in where people are needed and where people are, what people are prepared to do.
Oh, that's really interesting. And that's the mismatch issue that a lot of people have brought up, a lot of our listeners have brought up in advance of this series. What you just said, Lydia, completely relates to an email that we received last week from a listener, Robin in Hanover. He says, in a market economy, things are always somewhat out of whack. Too much housing, too little housing, too many workers, too few workers, too much education, too little education, on and on, Robin says. Never in equilibrium, always adjusting, but never seeming to adjust fast enough until finally the system adjusts further than we really wanted, often overshooting because we encourage too much of what we hadn't been getting enough of, and then the imbalances go the other way. Robin, thank you so much for those thoughts. And Brian Gottlob, to you, how much is this sort of the natural ebb and flow? And I love Robin's point that, there's too much of this, so we overcompensate, and then there's not enough of the other.
Right. I mean, that's a great comment because the labor market is always changing. Technology's changing, industry's changing, the mix of occupations in industries are always changing, and it takes a while for the labor market, individuals in the labor market, training institutions, it takes a while before we recognize those changes, and we always are behind the curve in terms of recognizing where the next great job needs are. I mean, I think we've done a little bit better now, particularly in things like healthcare, because we know we're going to need a whole lot more healthcare workers because of the demographics. But in manufacturing, we don't know what changes are going to come about. So it is a real challenge to be able to do that. So it creates... And we're really in this right now. It creates a situation where there is a mismatch between...
We're always playing catch-up.
We're always playing catch-up. I mean, I looked at data at the end of 2018, and it showed the number of workers who were looking for jobs that had less than a post-secondary degree, and compared that to the number of jobs that required less than a post-secondary degree. So basically, there was twice as many people looking for jobs who didn't have a post-secondary degree than were jobs that required them. The other end, jobs that did require a post-secondary degree, there was half as many people who had the qualifications, who had a post-secondary degree, looking for the jobs that were available. So there was about 10,000 jobs that were out there that were being advertised in New Hampshire, and a little less than 6,000 people with those qualifications looking. At the other end, jobs that didn't require a post-secondary degree, it was just the opposite. Twice as many jobs, twice as many people looking, half as many jobs. So there's a real mismatch in terms of the skill level. When we're in a situation like we are right now, and we are going to be in for decades, Laura, where labor force is going to continue to grow more slowly, we have to do a better job of matching. If we don't get our policies and our institutions and our labor market, people who inform the labor market, doing a better job of informing workers, young people, of what the opportunities are and getting them, making them a better match, then we're going to really exacerbate what's already going to be a difficult problem.
And when you say post-secondary degree, Brian, just to clarify, you're not talking about a PhD from Harvard.
No,
you're saying,
no.
Get a 2-year certificate
Right,
in
exactly,
HVAC
exactly.
or get a nursing degree. My goodness, anywhere you look, there's so many vacancies for healthcare workers.
Yeah, sure. There's vacancies in almost all occupations. There just isn't the right match of skills to meet that demand.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, one area where you find it where it does not require necessarily even a post-secondary degree, but it require training and skills is in the construction industry, which is really being hammered by this shortage in labor. A lot of it is because so many people who have those skills in construction, carpenters, masons, plumbers, they're getting older. And the replacement level is way low, and it's not. You see this in the construction industry. You talk to people in construction, they can't take jobs sometimes because they don't have enough people to work. They could be getting more work, but they can't hire people, so they have to turn jobs down. Just the other day, I live in the Manchester Mill Yard now, and they're building a new hotel down there. I take my dog down there for a walk in the morning, and I noticed some of the construction people coming in to park in the morning. They're from other states. They're bringing people from other states to work at this job in Manchester because that's where they're finding the people to work. And this is the kind of thing we're seeing not only in construction but in manufacturing, and actually in retail and in hospitality. Those are not the most highest skilled jobs, but there's still a lot of jobs available with fewer people to take them.
Well, and tomorrow in our show, as the series continues, because we're looking at this workforce shortage issue all week, we'll look more specifically at the individual sectors like healthcare and so forth that you mentioned and how they are trying to manage this. I want to remind our listeners that you can join us. Our number here in the Exchange is 1-800-892-6477. Email exchange@nhpr.org. Once again, exchange@nhpr.org. You can use Facebook or Twitter. It's NHPR Exchange. Again, our number 1-800-892-6477. Lydia, what else is important to keep in mind when we talk about a shortage or a 2.4 unemployment number? What other factors do you want to make sure on the table when people talk about this?
Yeah, no, a few things. So one thing, Laura, as you mentioned or asked the question, is this a cyclical thing that just happens every few years when the economy's hot, or is there something different this time? And I want to highlight the fact that there has been this longer-term decline in economic mobility and geographic mobility that is what we call structural, and it's been underway for a long time. And that means that if there's higher unemployment rates in a place like Louisiana or Alabama, those folks are less likely to relocate for the types of jobs that employers are screaming about in New Hampshire. And that's for a number of reasons, including, as the workforce ages, it becomes less mobile, but also it's things like housing prices that were mentioned earlier, right? If housing is prohibitively expensive in a place like, the Bay Area, too, is desperate for workers, but housing there is insane, then folks are not going to be able to pick up and move. It's also family ties and that kind of thing. But on a policy front, that seems to be something that we need to address. And the other factor in this that's been touched on briefly is wages, right? Because a lot of these blue-collar occupations have seen wage stagnation for a long time. And so even though we're starting to see pay rise in sectors like construction now, there's a lot to make up for. Remember, these jobs used to be, to a much greater degree, unionized and have very predictable benefits and job security, and especially, manufacturing is the prototypical example of this. And that's been less the case in this last generation. And so when we talk about shortages, we need to remember, how attractive are these jobs really? Is it enough to motivate someone to go through 2 years of schooling or pick up and move? Because do they know that job is, A, going to put them on a path towards a middle-class life, and B, not leave them hanging when the industry suddenly crashes? Like, a lot of people left these professions during the Great Recession because it disappeared. So that's why job quality is so important, and some kind of guarantee that this is worth investing in for people.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. I'm so glad you raised that point. And Brian, you and I have talked about wages many, many times before. What do you think about this point that Lydia makes, that, employers who complain about workforce shortages should cough it up, pay people a little bit more, give them better benefits, give them a better work-life balance?
Yeah, and I think that to a degree in New Hampshire, and I've been kind of tough on New Hampshire businesses in the past. I've said, one way to deal with labor shortages is to raise wages. But I really think we're at a point now where that's not even enough. Raising wages isn't going to be enough, that we're at such a low level of unemployment. It's going to be very difficult by simply the issue of raising wages. And, I have a little bit of a disagreement with the notion that wages haven't risen. When you look at the aggregate wage, when somebody says, how much is the average hourly wage in New Hampshire risen? Well, it doesn't look all that attractive. But that's affected by the mix of jobs. The mix of high-paying versus lower-paying industries and occupations. And one of the things, as I mentioned just a little while ago, is that it is almost impossible now to hire really highly skilled occupations in New Hampshire. There's a real shortage.
When you say highly skilled, just give us an example of what that means.
Engineers, scientists, computer systems analysts, those kinds of jobs. A lot of professional and business services. It's very difficult. So those jobs are going unfilled for a longer period of time. And while it's very difficult to hire anybody, even lower skilled jobs, those jobs are still a little bit easier. So the mix of jobs has changed, and it affects the aggregate. I last week looked at 20 occupations, specific occupations, not the aggregate wage, for a range of high paid jobs and lower paid jobs. And I can tell you, every one of them across the spectrum over the last 2 years has increased the median wage in New Hampshire by twice what has been the increase in the consumer price index. So at the individual occupational level, it has risen. At the aggregate level, because the mix of jobs is being affected, it doesn't look as attractive. But I do believe we have raised wages.
Well, we heard a lot about wages from our listeners. Got an email just this morning from Martine. She says, I would really, emphasized, love to work in New Hampshire. My husband and I bought a house in Northwood 5 years ago. He works in New Hampshire but has only been able to be a contract worker. Martine says, I commute to Boston to work. That's over 80 miles each way, but there's more work and better paying work for me down in Massachusetts. The only work I can find in New Hampshire pays $10 to $15 an hour. That's without any health insurance and overtime pay. And then we also heard from Carla. She wrote in. She says, I've recently moved from Massachusetts to Portsmouth, hoping to eventually transition from my job in the tech industry in Mass to something comparable in New Hampshire. Carla says, in the past few months, I've had 4 phone interviews, starting with salary questions. While these jobs are varying skill sets, nothing proceeded any further as none of these companies were willing to pay a base salary of $40,000. Carla says, I know the living expenses are higher in the Seacoast, but no matter, I can't imagine supporting oneself on anything less than $40,000. Back to Mass I go, Carla says. Are the salaries that these local companies offer due to that ridiculously sad minimum wage? So, Jeff Feingold, to you, what about what Carla says and Martine? Back to Mass I go.
Well, you actually all you have to do is drive down 93 South in the morning, and you see how many people work in Massachusetts. Same thing in 95 going down from the Seacoast.
What is it? 100,000 people a day? Is that the estimate?
It's in the 6 figures. I used to know the exact number, but I'm getting too old for that. But it's very high, and the thing is that really, in Massachusetts, you've time and time again, you'll talk to people who do that, and I know lots of people who do work in Mass and live in New Hampshire, and they say they're willing to even pay the Massachusetts income tax because they still make more money. Even after paying that income tax, they're still making more money than they would be making in New Hampshire. I do know, though, that there are some businesses, especially along the border there, like BAE Systems, which has which requires a lot of highly skilled employees, and they've been really fighting to get. They're going just booming. Their business is booming, and they're constantly looking for engineers and people like that. And I think that their wages are comparable to Massachusetts, from what I understand. But that's a rare thing that's rare compared to most other New Hampshire employers. They're not paying the same amounts of money. I guess they still feel like they don't have to. But what we are seeing is people, as I think was Carla said, back to Mass I go, and that's what they end up doing.
Well, Carla and Martine, thank you very much for the comments. And Lydia, one last question for you, and then we'll let you go. Are you seeing these issues play out elsewhere in the country that our guests in studio are talking about? And do you see any states, Lydia, that you think are doing a good job adapting to these workforce challenges?
Yeah, I don't think anyone has figured it out, but I think that one thing that is important to recognize is that after the recession, employers got used to demanding high degrees of education for jobs that didn't always need it, and that was called over-credentialing. And I think that they're going back through and thinking about, do we really need a college degree for this job, or should we broaden the types of workers that we even allow through our application screen to interview? And so there have been studies on how employers are starting to relax those requirements to look at people they might not otherwise have looked at. I mean, I was just pulled up New Hampshire's labor force participation rate. Like, it's been on the decline since the late 1980s. There was an uptick in the late 90s, and it's been falling since. And, part of that is demographics, but I bet a lot of that is people just figuring it's not worth it to work because those wages aren't high enough, or there's the other problem that I'm sure you guys have talked about a lot is opioid addiction. And so bringing more people into the workforce, making sure that you look at workers you may not have looked at before. The last several years have been remarkable in how people who are characterized as disabled have been coming back into the labor force. The unemployment rates for ethnic and racial minorities are lower than they have been historically, even though they're still much higher than for white folks. So that process should continue as employers start to broaden what they're looking at. But, I mean, a lot of states, and this is really important to note too, has started to tackle this problem by trying to provide more child care benefits, paid leave. These are the kinds of things that keep people out of the labor force because they can't find a job that is forgiving or has a flexible schedule. Women's labor force participation has stagnated, even though we're in a hot economy. It's been recovering a little bit more in recent years, but as you know, they're often the primary caretakers. And so if you want to recruit women to your workforce, you should probably make it so that she can handle family responsibilities. That's important for men too, but just currently that's still how the division of tasks breaks down. So anyway, there's a lot going on here, and I think New Hampshire is doing what it can, but I think it's being way up there in the northeast corner of the country. It faces a little bit more barriers in terms of attracting people, retaining people, and then there's this term in economics: wages are sticky, right? Employers sometimes are resistant to changing their compensation packages to really adjust to what the market wage is. And I don't think that's fully happened yet. As readers were noting, it's just if you can drive 80 miles and get, $10,000 more per year, that's what you're going to do.
Well, Lydia, I'm glad you mentioned those various workers that employers might have overlooked in the past and are now starting to tap into a little bit more, because day 3 of our series is going to focus specifically on that, those untapped workers here in the Granite State. It's been great having you, Lydia. Thank you very much.
Hey, my pleasure.
That's Lydia DePillis, senior economics writer for CNN Business. And coming up, a little bit more on demographics and workforce. We're going to hear from UNH senior demographer Ken Johnson, and we'll start taking more of your calls and emails. Our number here in the Exchange is 1-800-892-6477. You can email us, exchange@nhpr.org. We'll be right back.
This is NHPR. Good morning. And if you own or operate a business, you can get your message to the entire state by simply becoming an NHPR underwriter. Visit nhpr.org/underwrite to find out more about our many underwriting opportunities. Support for NHPR comes from you, our listeners, and from Market Street Talent, providing IT staffing and consulting services to help bring talented professionals and employers together. Learn more at marketstreettalent.com. And from Nashua Community College, providing career training programs such as the Microelectronics Bootcamp and Microsoft Image Academy. More at nashuacc.edu/NHPR. And from Retail Control Systems Enfield, offering retail solutions and credit card services to all sizes of retailers and restaurants for over 30 years. More information at retailcontrolsystems.com. This is NHPR.
This is The Exchange. I'm Laura Knoy. Today, The Exchange goes in-depth with 4 shows on New Hampshire's workforce shortage. Now, this hour, we're looking at the numbers and the factors behind this, and we're hearing from you. How do you see this issue affecting the state overall, or you personally? How severe do you think this workforce shortage really is, and what do you think might be driving it? We'd love to hear from you. Send us an email, exchange@nhpr.org. Once again, exchange@nhpr.org. Use Facebook or Twitter at NHPR Exchange, or give us a call, 1-800-892-6477. And in addition to listening to our broadcast today, you can watch it on Facebook Live. With me in studio, Brian Gottlob, principal at PolEcon Economic Research in Dover, and Jeff Feingold, editor at New Hampshire Business Review. And both of you, it came up in our last segment, but let's talk about it a little bit more. The demographic factor here in New Hampshire. As jobs expand, the workforce is not expanding as rapidly. We spoke last week with UNH senior demographer Ken Johnson, and he outlined for us the essential demographic problem for New Hampshire's workforce.
I think that New Hampshire would be better off if it had more young people in the state, whether that comes through migration or through the growing up of children in New Hampshire. That's one challenge the state faces. Right now, the state barely has enough births to offset its deaths. And so natural increase, which is what demographers call the difference between births and deaths, which has typically provided population to New Hampshire, is now much less a factor in the growth of the New Hampshire population. So again, it comes down to the fact that migration is critically important to New Hampshire's future.
So, Brian and Jeff, what do you see in your communities in terms of this demographic issue? Brian, you're in Dover. Jeff, you're in Manchester. So, Jeff, go ahead.
Actually, it's interesting because I've worked in Manchester for 35 years, and when we first moved there, we had an office on Elm Street, and at 5 o'clock it was dead.
And Elm Street, we should.
It's the main drag.
The main
in,
drag,
in,
yeah.
in Manchester. There were offices, but no one was there. There were a couple of restaurants. I remember that at one point there were so few people there that even the McDonald's on Elm Street closed down, which is pretty amazing when you think about McDonald's. There was very little to attract people to downtown Manchester. But what happened was what they've done though is because with the mill yard, the economic boom, the tech boom that's going on in the mill yard, has attracted a lot of new people to the city, and by doing that, they've also just naturally there's developed downtown housing. So there's people who live downtown.
Getting back to the housing issue.
Yes, and that has spawned a growth in it's a great restaurant scene in Manchester. And what you can go down to any night of the week and you'll see people walking along Elm Street, going to restaurants, going to bars, just hanging out, and what it is, and if you look, they're young people, they're younger, because it's not the typical scene you'll see in a New Hampshire community.
Well, and you moved to Manchester from New London.
From New London, which is the
older.
exact opposite. When I'd go into the supermarket, I'd see myself. Just a lot of old people. But you go into the supermarket in Manchester, there's people from all over the world, and there's people from much younger with a lot of children, and it's a different world in Manchester as opposed to what we hear about going on in so many other communities in New Hampshire.
Brian, you've talked on this show a lot about Dover's Renaissance.
Yeah, they were. I do a lot of presentations around the state, and I say this all the time. You can walk into any community in New Hampshire and know immediately whether it will be attractive to younger demographics. We talk about this issue as if it's a mystery. What can the state do? What policies can we enact that will make more young people want to move into New Hampshire? Well, just look at the communities where it's happening, because that's the key. It's the local decisions that they're made. Housing is important, but I would argue it's not just cheap housing. It's reasonably priced, but as importantly, it's housing in communities that offer amenities that younger people like. Look at Portsmouth. I mean, look at Dover, increasingly a place like Manchester, and Concord, by the way. Concord, we're starting to see it. So it's places where young people, one, can live kind of within walking distance to amenities, social amenities, cultural amenities, natural amenities, civic amenities, restaurants, bars. They want to be in places where they can hang out with other young people. There are plenty of communities where that has happened. But if you really look, the 234 communities in New Hampshire, I can think of maybe a dozen where you really can say this is a place young people are going to want to live.
Well, we talked, as I said earlier, with Ken Johnson, and I asked him about this, and he said New Hampshire's doing a pretty good job right now attracting people in that 30 to 40-something demographic. And Ken said with people in their 20s, there's really only so much you can do.
This is the most mobile part of the population in the United States. Many of them want to go to a new place, try a new thing, go to a big urban core where there's all the excitement and energy of the cores. So, New Hampshire is doing, I think, reasonably well at this, but you have to accept the fact that there's going to be a lot of mobility in that population. I had a woman say to me after one of my presentations, she said, I don't mind that my son is going to Boston and is going to work in a big company for a few years, but when he gets to the age where he's going to have children and they're going to be my grandchildren, I'd like him to be back in New Hampshire.
So it's part of really just normal major population fluctuations where people are at in their lives. It sounds like you're saying there's only so much New Hampshire can really do.
Right. I mean, what any place can do is limited by life cycle changes, which are driving forces in migration, not just in New Hampshire, not just in the United States, but in many parts of the world. It's always been the people in their 20s, which are the most mobile part of the population.
Okay, so again, that's Ken Johnson, Senior Demographer at UNH's Carsey School of Public Policy. Go ahead, Jeff Feingold.
I just want to say, just to address what Ken was saying about mobility, on my morning walk with my dog, I always, I look at the parking lots in the mill yard where all these tech companies are, and you see people from all different parts of the country who've taken jobs in there. South Dakota, South Carolina, North Carolina.
So not just people
California.
commuting from Massachusetts or Maine.
No, it's not. It's all over the country, and it's really interesting because they're coming to Manchester to take jobs, and they're young people.
Well, let's go back to our listeners. And again, our number here in the exchange is 1-800-892-6477. We'd love your emails too, exchange@nhpr.org. And Greg's calling from Concord. Hi, Greg. You're on the air. Welcome.
Hi. Couple of observations being in the workforce and comparing myself to my daughter who's just starting out. And I see a lot of the same things. Being treated well, time off, productivity. There's always the argument that we're less productive if you give people too much time off, and it's a problem, backfilling, when someone's out. Yet these things help with retention, help people believe in what they're doing, want to be loyal to their company. It's talked about. You go on job boards, good quality of life or whatever, work-life balance, but I still think that employers are way behind on that. That's a problem because it's changing. So you might be able to employ a bunch of people and get young people in there, but will they stay? So those are things I observe, not just with young people, but people like myself, being able to take 2 weeks off at Christmas and go and see my folks in England. This kind of stuff, it's harder here, and I feel like employers are way behind, like a Victorian way of operating almost.
Greg, thank you so much for calling. Brian, I was talking to a friend from France just yesterday, and she was talking about her upcoming vacation, and let me just say it was a lot more than my upcoming vacation. I'm not putting down NHPR, but Europeans do get weeks and weeks and weeks where they can sort of renew and refresh.
Sure, and I think, that issue of human resource policies and benefits related to work-life balance, all of those things are important in helping individual businesses attract more or fewer workers, but they don't fundamentally address what is the underlying issue. How many people are being born in New Hampshire?
The demographics that we keep getting back to.
Right. So we can shift these individuals around by having better or worse policies related to the work environment, and that would be great. Some businesses have an advantage, but it doesn't address that fundamental issue that we're going to be dealing with. We have fewer people being born. We have the lowest birth rate in the nation, and we have fewer people moving into the state, and that we can't overcome with human resource policies like that.
Well, it's good to hear from you, Greg. Thank you. And Steve sent us an email. He says, great discussion. I think young people entering the workforce are in a great situation as long as they have a degree or a certificate. Steve says, however, as someone in their middle years, I am currently working at a job well below my skill level because it's the only job I could get. I have a lot of experience, great references, and recently completed a second degree and 2 certificate programs. At a job fair, I was informed by several hiring managers that employers are not interested in hiring experience. Any statistics that reflect this? This gets back to the education piece that we were talking about earlier. Jeff, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, that is something, and it's something you hear. It's very disturbing. Although I know many employers are.
And here's Steve trying to do his best, get the education.
Yeah, I know people. Many employers are embracing hiring people who are older, who maybe are going to a second career. But I do think the same thing with Brian, as Brian was saying earlier about something else. Is they're slow. Most employers are slow to accept this. They have preconceived notions. They have stereotypes of older workers. They have. It's not. It's certainly in the short run. It's definitely not in their interests of the employer to avoid hiring people with experience, with knowledge, with the kind of thing that you don't. It doesn't come overnight. And while there have been a lot of attempts, I know the AARP is very aggressive on this. And other organizations, it's still not enough to overcome that stereotype, which is really, considering where New Hampshire is right now, the employers better learn how to get over that stereotype, because that's pretty much where the people are out there.
Well, Steve, thank you for the email. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about more on Wednesday's show as we look at groups of workers, those untapped potential employees. Thank you, Steve. Here's another email from Gary. Your first speaker mentioned regulations as a factor in the labor shortage. We hear regulations are a huge factor in many issues regarding business development, yet no one asks what specific regulations are you talking about. Gary says, number one, in the future, when someone mentions on your show that regulations are a drag on business or the economy, please ask your speakers to be specific as to which regulations and how these are affecting business. Number two, Gary says, please ask, I think it was Brian, to name the regulations he feels are exasperating the labor shortage and how they are doing so. And Gary, thank you so much for the email. And Brian, go ahead. That's for you.
Yeah, well, first, my point was originally not that regulations were a big drag. I was saying that businesses often cite regulations that we spend a lot of time focusing on things like energy prices and big business regulations, when in fact the labor force issue is the preeminent issue affecting businesses. But
I see. So he misheard you a little bit there.
But there are regulations that do affect the labor, and a lot of them have to do with credentialing in the state. How easy it is if you're a certified occupation in another state to move to New Hampshire. And I actually did a little bit of looking at this several months ago, and those individuals who were certified or had some kind of state occupational licensing in another state had much lower rates of movement into New Hampshire than individuals who didn't have that certification. So it was apparent when you look at those occupational licensing requirements that we don't make it easy. We don't make the transition. So that affects our ability to import workers from other places, the migration issue. And it's really important in things like the healthcare field, where you have, certifications, you have different kinds of licensing in medical fields. To move from one state to another, and in New Hampshire, can be particularly difficult. So that is an issue of regulations that do affect the labor force and the size of the labor force.
I have heard that complaint time and time again. We did a whole hour on it, I think last year sometime. So, Gary, I'm glad you raised it, because when you say before you can work as an X, Y, or Z, you must have credential A, B, or C. And in many fields, Brian, it does seem like the state or the town is requiring people to be over-credentialed.
Well, if certainly maybe a different set
That's
of credentials.
The criticism anyway.
Yeah, and I don't doubt that that's a problem. It's the credentialing process isn't the same. There's not a lot of uniformity, and if you're somebody who's got a credential in a state and you see opportunities in New Hampshire. And are you going to move here if you aren't sure your credentials are going to be accepted? I mean, it can happen in everything from engineering, medical fields, to even things like teaching. Those credentials. So, and I don't know that teaching is one of those issues that it's a problem, but I have heard it in a number of occupations that it is a problem.
Gary, thank you so much for the email. Go ahead,
I just
Jeff.
want to say, back in, I believe in the 2017 session, the legislature passed a bill specifically to make it easier for nurses from other states to take jobs here, because that nursing shortage is one of the more extreme shortages we've seen all over the state, and that was an act by the legislature to do that. And to what Brian's saying, okay, let's do it in some other fields as well.
Let's take another call, both of you, and this is Tim in Durham. Hi, Tim. You're on the air. Go ahead. Welcome.
Hello. I'm going to comment on the political establishment is out of touch with the concerns of working people, especially younger one. And I guess I'm a member of the establishment myself. I've been a state rep from Durham for 11 years. And higher education is a key driver of the economy, both for get people credentialed as an employer, and at least certainly the Republicans in Concord are, actively hostile to higher education. Also the public transportation, which is a big, like we have commuter rail in Dover, and that's one of the big reasons why Dover's a hometown. But talk to any Republican about rail, and they'll, smoke will come out of the ears. But the most telling example, we have the controversy over the Family Medical Leave Act, which is something that's obviously highly attractive to people who either have children or elderly parents and need to take time off while still continuing their careers. And Sununu vetoed that on the grounds that the payroll reduction was, in his views, an income tax, which it really wasn't. It's just a payroll deduction. But he obviously felt an income tax is such a bad thing that it cancels out any benefits from family medical leave. But it was ironic that it sounds like over 100,000 New Hampshireites are in fact crossing the border to Massachusetts to voluntarily pay a broad-based income tax. So obviously it doesn't bother at least that segment of the population.
So, Tim, as a state rep, what policies or changes would you like to see that might make New Hampshire's workforce more robust? You already mentioned family medical leave. What else?
Yeah. Well, more money for higher education and vocational training. Also, just more guaranteeing rights for workers. I think raising the minimum wage would be a good step forward, even though not that many people are working for the minimum wage. But that would and of course the Family Medical Leave Act would help. Then also, just taking a more robust role in developing communities. So I like to be because a lot of times, they get the employers up here, and then I think the things employers care about. They don't necessarily care that we don't have a sales tax or an income tax, or they have liquor stores on the highway, or all these other things that us, politicians in Concord are so proud of. I think it's,
Tim,
things are more difficult than that.
Yeah, and we'll talk about some of those issues after a short break, so I'm glad you called. We already talked about housing, guys, but we should talk about some of the other items that our caller raises, including transportation. So all that's coming up. Stay with us. This is The Exchange on NHPR.
Frederick Law Olmsted created some of our most famous parks. Less well known is his searing account of the American South in the 1850s for the New York Times. Spying on the South is a new account that retraces that journey by a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. Tony Horowitz on his Odyssey Across the American Divide. Next time on 1A.
That's this morning at 10 here on NHPR. Support for NHPR comes from you, our listeners, and from Vital Communities, bringing people together to cultivate the civic, environmental, and economic vitality of the Upper Valley for 25 years. Learn more at vitalcommunities.org. And from Norse Cotton Cancer Center, hosting the 38th Prouty Charity Challenge, July 13th in Hanover, New Hampshire. Registration at theprouty.org. This is NHPR.
This is The Exchange. I'm Laura Knoy. Tomorrow in our show, the second in our workforce series, how different sectors of our economy are feeling the shortage and what they're doing about it. That's tomorrow in The Exchange. This hour, we're taking a big picture view of the workforce shortage as we kick off our series, looking at the numbers and some of the factors that define it. And we're getting your input. Send us an email. It's exchange@nhpr.org or give us a call, 1-800-892-6477. And in addition to listening to our show today, you can watch it on Facebook Live. My guests in studio, Brian Gottlob, principal at PolEcon Economic Research in Dover, and Jeff Feingold, editor at New Hampshire Business Review. And gentlemen, we heard from a lot of listeners even before the series got started, so that's great. And we've been sharing some emails that we got from folks. We also got a call before the series began from Deb, who made the point that there is more to that very low unemployment rate that we often cite here in New Hampshire than might meet the eye. Let's hear.
Yeah, hi, this is Deb Osgood from Exeter, and I've been working with workforce development and economic development in the state for 25 years, and I'm concerned that the current challenges are more about a disconnect in speaking the same language versus a labor shortage. For example, a 2018 study by a firm called Jobonomics finds that as many as 95 million Americans can work but choose not to, where the Department of Labor refers to this category as not in labor force, and yet when we report the unemployment rate in the news, this population sector is not included. This indicates that there may be a lot more people looking for work in New Hampshire than understood. And if that's the case, addressing New Hampshire's workforce challenge may also be about identifying who is not working and why, as well as better aligning supply with demand.
Deb, thank you so much for your input. And Brian, I really appreciate the call because there are other measures. And every time we talk about the unemployment rate on this program, people say that doesn't include various aspects of this problem. So what else is important to look at? For example, that not in labor force number that Deborah mentions.
Yeah, New Hampshire first has a pretty high labor force participation. 70% or so overall of individuals 16 or older participate in the labor force.
So people who could work are working.
Yeah, a
70%.
lot. So there's 30% who aren't. 30% of the working age population is not in the labor force. So that sounds like a huge number. That's a great untapped resource. But, when you look at the underlying demographics and characteristics of that population, it doesn't look quite the same.
Teenagers, college students.
A lot of young people, look, I've just looked at this for a project I did a few months ago. 20 years ago, 50% of young people 16 to 19 were in the labor force. Now it's about 34%, 35%. So we've seen a decline there. We've seen some decline among older men, particularly individuals with less skills, fewer skills, less educated. Lydia mentioned things like substance abuse. I did a project on that issue, and I calculated alcohol and drug abuse cut the male labor force by about 1% in the state. So that's significant. That was 15,000.
That's a lot of people.
15,000 people or so. So you've got that. You've got more increasing rates of disability. So that's also part of it. But there's really a couple of measures that are really important to focus on. One is the official unemployment rate. That's the one that gets all the headlines. That's that 2.4% rate that we talk about in New Hampshire. But then there's this other mysterious one that everybody cites as, it's, as evidence that the economy really isn't all that strong. And that's what's called the U6 rate. And that includes discouraged workers, which are people who have worked or looked for work in the last year, but in the last 4 weeks haven't looked for work, and contingent workers, people who would like to work and have worked in the past year or looked for work in the past year, but for some reason they can't work right now. It's a health issue. It could be anything else. And it also includes that U6 number, people who are working part-time who want to be working full-time.
And that's important, isn't it, Brian?
That's about a little over 2% in New Hampshire. So when you add it all up, the 2.4% plus the 0.5% or so of discouraged and contingent workers, plus the 2% of people who are working part-time who want to be working full-time, you get a rate that is about double, 5.2 to 5.4%. That's still pretty darn good. That's still a very low unemployment rate, but it does capture more of the issue that Deborah was talking about.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I just wanted to add that some of the I've thought about this. I've talked to other employers about this, and some of the things they think might be causing these discouraged workers to not be able to work is not so much as discouraged about their prospects, but because they might not have a car. And since New Hampshire doesn't exactly have the greatest public transportation system, they're basically stuck within a radius for jobs. They can't go any place else. So while there might be a job in a town 20 miles away, they can't get there. The other thing that's also preventing people from looking for jobs is the availability or lack of availability of affordable daycare. That's something else that people can't take a job because they have to care for their children. That's their priority. And there's no way for them to take a job that doesn't pay enough money or doesn't provide daycare services, and then you have those transportation issues going there. So there are things that I think are keeping people discouraged about entering the workforce because
that are solvable.
That are solvable.
Solvable if somebody kind of led them to resources where they could
they're
get
not
some help.
hurdles like saying there's not people sitting around watching Dr. Phil all day. You know what I mean? They want to work, but they have these hurdles that are just theirs, not by their own doing.
Sure, and young families, for example, often do a calculation. How much is childcare? And how much will I pay out for that versus how much will I make? It's not worth the stress and the hassle after they do that calculation. Yep. So thank you, Deb, for chiming in on our show today. We got an email from Mike who says there are times when manufacturers hire young workers for a job but have to let them go after the first random drug test. This happens quite a lot. This also needs to be discussed. Mike, thank you so much. And Brian, you talked about that, but go ahead.
Yeah, there is a real problem with substance misuse issues in the workplace. I talked to a company, an individual who does testing for employers, and I just asked him, I said, what's your failure rate? And he said it's now about half of the jobs that require someone to be tested. He finds that among applicants, about half of the individuals cannot pass the drug tests that are required for the occupation.
What kinds of jobs are we talking about that require drug tests?
Pretty much anything where there's a safety issue, either individual worker safety, other worker safety, public safety.
Dealing with heavy machinery, maybe?
Yeah, it could be driving. It could be a whole host of occupations. And increasingly, there are more employers who are looking at drug testing, substance abuse testing, because of liability issues, because of quality issues, safety issues, etc. So I was shocked at how big the problem was. And when I put together the numbers for males not in the workforce because of substance misuse issues, and that worked out to about 15,000. That doesn't even include women in the labor force. How many women are not in the labor force because of substance misuse issues? So that's a growing problem. The whole drug and alcohol misuse issue has really exacerbated the current problem.
Well, and I'll set that aside for now. But on Wednesday, we are going to talk more about, again, those workers or potential workers who may not be entering the workforce because of various issues, including substance abuse. I want to quickly return to something that you guys mentioned early in the show, and that's how this workforce shortage issue looks by region. And Jeff, just starting with you, what's the regional breakdown of some of the issues that Brian mentioned? Discouraged workers, workers who would go in, but they're missing the childcare piece or the transportation piece, or they've got the substance abuse problem. What are you seeing regionally in terms of workforce shortages?
Well, I do know that what we see regionally is that places like, let's say, the Upper Valley, the Seacoast, the Manchester area, Nashua area, that's and Concord area. That's a lot of that is driven by the housing piece, which is it's less and less affordable housing, and that's also preventing people from moving into the area and taking jobs. But then you have other areas, like the North Country in particular, other rural areas, perhaps in the Lakes region as well, where a lot of it really is driven by this idea that by the hemorrhaging. I guess that's a little extreme, but really the much more exacerbated loss of younger people, the younger demographic. Those areas of the state are much older, and that's making a workforce shortage issue, especially in those two regions where there's a big tourism industry. And as Brian was saying, there's a less and less participation by younger people who are still there working in those industries, and those industries have been hard hit by this. Plus, if you add in the other factors of limits on visas for temporary work permits in the summertime, that's really hurt that industry a lot. But
we haven't even talked about the immigration issue,
yes,
right?
And those are the kind of things. Those are the issues that are affecting those parts of the state. But then there's other parts of the state, like in Keene, where there's a housing affordability issue at some point, but also a big part of it is transportation, people getting into and out of the Keene area. I'm not saying that these are the only issues affecting those areas, but there's different emphasis in different parts of the state.
Brian, do you want to jump in? Last thoughts?
Yeah, no, transportation is important, particularly in the western part of the state. I think it's different. It's also been a real asset in the Seacoast. We have more transportation options in the Seacoast that has opened up the labor market, the greater Boston labor market, Eastern Mass labor market, and that's helped attract people to our region, which has allowed employment to grow faster in the Seacoast than in most other areas of the state.
All right. Well, lots more to talk about as the week continues. Thank you, gentlemen, for helping us kick it off. I really appreciate it. Brian Gottlob, always good to have you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Laura. Great.
Brian Gottlob is principal at PolEcon Economic Research. Jeff Feingold, great to have you. Thank you so much.
Great to be here, Laura.
Jeff Feingold, editor at New Hampshire Business Review. If you want to learn more about our workforce series this week, go to our website, NHPR.org. You can find the page for our series right there. You can find out what we're going to be talking about all week and contribute your thoughts. Again, it's NHPR.org. This is The Exchange on New Hampshire Public Radio.